Today we're taking a listener question. How do we come up with salary ranges when we hire people in the local church? And that being said, we have some open jobs. nwgospel.com/jobs. Check it out. Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where we explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture. We have a question today from a listener, a member here at NGC. And this actually came in back when we were in the First Timothy series. So
nice. All right.
Here it goes. Hey guys, after listening to the sermon this past Sunday, actually a couple months ago, I had a question about church hiring. Andrew's story about the interview in Idaho and the compensation discussion was enlightening, but it got me thinking, how do you come up with a number to even start compensation discussions in the church? I've been involved in hiring and compensation decisions at places I've worked. In my field, we often have physical deliverables and project deadlines, which tend to make position responsibilities and therefore compensation somewhat straightforward. But how do you boil down something with more of a, quote, soft skill set, say like a children's minister, into a salary number? Where do you even start? Okay, so I think we should start with Andrew's Idaho story. So why don't you tell us what Mike, our buddy here who asked the question, is referring to?
Yeah, and he's probably referring to the sermon from 1 Timothy 5, 17 to 25, or whatever that was, the last passage in 1 Timothy 5, where it was talking about remuneration with, elders. And so, yeah, I told a story about this church and the context was I was talking about how grateful we are at the culture that is at Northwest Gospel, a generous culture where people give generously, and our elders specifically try to honor the scriptures in having compensation be generous to those who are doing that work. And that passage talks about double honor to those who labor in preaching and teaching, which is a financial term there, that word honor, teme, in the Greek. So it is financial in context. And so I was talking about this story of this church in Idaho that we interviewed at. So we were coming out of seminary. It was 2006-ish, and my wife and I got married in 2004. We moved out to Boston. I was finishing up my MDiv at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary out there, and we were at a church there. She was on staff at the church as like the bookkeeper, and it was a church of probably like 600 people at the time, just north of Boston. And I was working at the seminary a little bit and doing school and trying to finish up. And so we were interviewing at I started sending resumes out, knowing we kind of wanted to move back to the Northwest. So I sent them all over the place, and we were responding to some stuff online, and the church there offered us a role long-term, and wanted to keep my wife on staff. And so we're flying around, we're interviewing these different places. And so there was a church in Idaho. I think it was right outside of Boise. I'd know the name of the town. It wasn't Boise, but it was one of those towns near there that was kind of blowing up at the time, which probably is still exploding in terms of population. And it was a church probably about a 500 to 800, so like a decent sized church, mid-sized to not super large, but getting larger. And the role was it was like an associate role, but I think it was kind of youth pastor and other responsibilities. So we get late in the process, and they've interviewed me several times by this point. And so they're like, hey, we would love to fly you out, you and your wife out here, to like interview in person and to kind of be the final step before offering you this role. And that was sort of like they're like, we want to offer this to you, but we'd love you to see it. And so, those deals. And I was on a phone conversation with their executive pastor at the time when he was like, hey, we'd love to buy the tickets. And so just give us the details of these dates. Can this work for you or whatever? And the church hadn't talked compensation. Like there was a job description, but there wasn't anything on it about what the role would be compensated for. And so I said, hey, before we fly out officially, like, do you guys have a compensation structure? Or is there a salary band that this works within or whatever? And what's the ballpark, or what's the specific, I'm not asking for an offer letter necessarily, but like, is there an idea of what this role would be compensated? And he kind of balked at it on the phone. And then he was like, why is that important? That's his first thing. And I was like, well, this is a full-time role, right? And he was like, yeah, it's full-time. And I was like, well, it's important. Are we going to move across the country and come on staff without knowing, am I going to fly out there and finish this interview process without even knowing the compensation? And then his response was, well, are you called to this, And so he kind of played the God card on me there. Like, are you called? And I was like, well, and my response was, I'm called to support my family. I'm getting out of seminary. I remember getting kind of into detail. I didn't tell this part in the sermon, but I was like, I've just walked through 6 straight years of education, undergraduate in biblical studies and languages, and I'm about to finish an MDiv, and like that costs money to do this. And so like I'm coming through this education, and like I want to be able to support my family. We want to start having kids, these kind of deals. So I need to know the compensation. And then he finally came back. I don't think I said this part in the sermon, but he finally came back and told me what the salary would start at. It was less than my wife was making as the bookkeeper at that church at the time, as like a full-time pastoral role. And I was like, yeah, that's not going to cut it, man. That's like not even close to what we would need to live in that area. We kind of knew the market in that area of Idaho. And so, and then he kind of ended with that spiritualizing thing of like, well, if you're called, that shouldn't matter or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, dude, I'm called to, my final thing was like, I'm called to support my family. So, I'm sorry this didn't work out, but, be praying for you guys. So that was kind of the end of the conversation. And so that's the story. That's the Idaho story. And just kind of a wild, I always think of that when I think of church compensation stuff. It's sort of the spiritualizing it was a big one for me. That was like a bit of a theological red flag, and because you're in the position when you're on my end of the phone call, you're like as if you're not being spiritual or you're being greedy or something weird, and so it was on.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder like why there's an idea of like, people like, the church just is like no one can make a living or whatever. Like, like that there's that idea. And then I hear stories like that. I'm like, oh, that's why that.
Yeah. People have an idea that like, if you're going to be in pastoral ministry or you're going to be on staff at a church, like you're going to make nothing and you're going to be poor and the whole deal, which none of that's biblical at all, but it is certainly a prevailing idea that people have about the church.
Yeah. What is biblical is that pastoral ministry is sacrificial and it's a servant role. But then that gets applied to like the compensation where you should be sacrificing financially to serve in this because you're called, right? And you don't do it for the money, which I just don't think is good. I think it's why a lot of guys burn out. I know that the mindset we've had here, which I appreciate and I think is the right mindset, is like pastoral ministry is already difficult enough and is a big enough burden that we don't want finances to be an additional burden, right? If that's something that we can make actually a blessing and not, then because ministry is already going to be hard no matter what you get paid. And so you add on that extra pressure to a guy and his family where they can't make ends meet, and it's a recipe for burnout, or them leaving because they need to make more, and but a lot of times, like even that guy kind of did, guys get shamed even for saying like, I need to make more, right? Like as if like that's worldly or greedy but no, I want to make more so I can support my family and then obviously be generous and open-handed and those sorts of things. So,
yeah.
All right, let's jump into the question. So how do you come up with a number to even start compensation discussions? And this is a great question. And I like the second paragraph here where it talks about in certain fields, his field specifically as physical deliverables, project deadlines, which kind of like lay out what the responsibilities, timelines, compensation should be. And this is a question we might have covered at some point, I don't know, but like, how do you boil down something with more like a skill set, like a children's minister? Like, how do you even come up with things to figure that out? And so, you want to jump in or what?
Yeah, there's a ton there. So when you talk about the compensation as it relates to staff members, and I'm just even on my computer here, I'm bringing up several different documents from over the years. We've written extensively on this over the years and studied this extensively because it has been, I think after some of those initial conversations like that one in Idaho, that kind of stuck with me. Again, I was 25. I wasn't in the position of hiring people yet. And the way that story ultimately ends is we came on staff at a church in Olympia, and I was a youth pastor there, larger church. And what appealed to me in that process, especially after that Idaho experience, and we had flown to Iowa at one point to interview with a church there, and again, the church in Boston. But what appealed to me about the Olympia church was not necessarily like the salary was far and away above. I think the Boston church was offering us more than the Olympia church, but we wanted to come home to the Northwest. And when I was meeting with their lead guy, he was really clear on the salary stuff. And his thing was like, hey, we're a larger church. We're one of the largest churches in our network in this region of the Northwest, in this region of the country, and we're going to make sure that that our people are well paid. And I had no idea about the market at the time. Like I didn't know what a guy made versus this or whatever else. And so no clue. And I don't think most people coming out of seminary have much of a clue on that. Unless, even doing research on it, like to know kind of the industry from the inside, that's hard to find that stuff a lot of times. So when you look at these national surveys, they're not always super accurate because the sample size is so big. But so coming into that, his thing though was, in a couple of things that we did up in our church in Olympia, we've implemented at Northwest Gospel Church. He said, number one, every single staff member is going to have their salary reviewed every single year. Like that's going to be a thing in the budget process, that there's always going to be salary reviews. Number two, there's always an open door policy with any of our staff members as it relates to their, overseers and direct report structures, that you can bring up those conversations. Like, you don't want to be talking about that all the time, but like, if your family, we want to support you. And then number three, you're going to be paid on merit. Not based upon like, well, this is what a youth pastor should make. So if you do a good job, the fruitfulness in ministry, you're being faithful and you're producing fruit, like you will be, you'll get raises kind of thing. And so that super appealed to me, the kind of communication, the merit, those kind of deals. And so, and then one of the final things he said to me was like, as it relates to even supporting your family, buying a home in the community, raising your kids, these kind of deals, like we give, we're going to support the family in terms of, compensation and benefit structures, insurance structures, all those things. And so we're gonna create a dynamic where you can support your family in doing this, right? And that you're not gonna have to worry about what you make as it relates to being in pastoral ministry if you're doing a good job and producing fruit. And so it's funny because the question even asked about like the deliverables, right? But there are deliverables in ministry. Like there really are. There's like if we look at the different people on our staffs, like there are metrics that are kept. And now everything isn't based on those metrics, obviously, but when you look at a lead pastor salary, this is the first thing, when you look at a lead pastor salaries are typically, and I would say vast majority of the time, they are linked to the size and budget of a local church. So if you're interviewing for different churches and you're looking at pay structures, the size of your local church and the budget of that local church, there's going to not a direct proportion of that, like 8% of that or something is going to be the lead pastor's salary. But as you look at lead pastor salaries, those are going to be linked mostly to the size and budget of a church, right? And then as it relates to the salaries of everyone else on a staff, their salary and kind of the salary ranges are going to be related to the salary range of that lead pastor. So which is again linked to kind of the size and budget of a local church. So churches that are larger and have bigger budgets, their lead pastors are going to make more than churches that are smaller and have smaller budgets. Now, one of the aspects of the multi-church structure that we have is it kind of breaks that mold a little bit, because we're not simply like Ben. You're not simply a solo pastor in a church that's a certain size with a certain budget, and then it's setting that there. You're a part of the larger church structure with 5 local churches that has the shared collective budget that we all share together. And so salaries can be set a little bit different in that regard, which frankly is a great structure for both lead pastors and for staff pastors and staff members to be at a larger organization like this, because you guys, like throughout the ranks, people are going to be paid more based upon a larger budget, more margin. And even when it comes to benefit structures, when you're covering benefits for X number of employees, if your employee group is 10 people versus if it's 60 of people who are covered with benefits, you're going to get better benefit deals. And so the church will be able to offer better things. So that's a little bit about the basics of those salary structures. And then as you look throughout the ranks, you mentioned a children's minister, right? Like a children's minister is going to have a certain size of ministry that they're leading. They're going to have their responsibilities that they're doing. Obviously, they're within their job description. They're going to need to be meeting those things. And then it's not like they're making a certain number of sales every month, but they are building leaders. They are recruiting people. They are, running ministry and those kind of deals. And so while there's not a direct one-to-one link with those types of deals, there is ministries. If you're a youth pastor and you come in and you inherit a youth ministry of 15 kids, and you're leading there for 5 years and it grows and it's 120 kids, like your salary is going to go up. Like if your church is healthy and you guys are handling the stuff, your salary is going to be raised, because little by little as it's reviewed, if you're in a church with a review structure. So I got more thoughts, but I don't want to.
I think that one thing that's interesting, and I think the question might be speaking to this a little bit, is like in just like in a product based world, you sell more products, you make more money, you are doing better at your job. Like that is clear, right? In ministry is a little bit different, to where there are tactics you can employ to grow a church that aren't actually healthy, right? And there's a lot of ways that you, no one like, or I guess outside of like fraudulent things, no one's going to look at your product and be like, oh, like you sold that many. Oh, are you sure that's actually good for your business? Like, you know what I mean?
Sure.
Whereas in the church world, there's tons of examples of like growth that happens that's not actually making disciples, right? Which is the goal of the church, rather than just people in the seats. Like we talked about last week, how many people are in your church, or how much church is in your people, that idea, right? And so like that does create an issue where it's like, okay, if it's not just numbers based, then like, because the temptation could be, well, I can grow a crowd, but without actually making disciples. And if my compensation is based solely on that, then I'll do that. And so it's been tough, but we've worked hard here, I think, to find the metrics that actually matter.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, for instance, for a lot of our staff folks, like specifically in children's youth ministry, stuff like that, it is a few things. We measure like how well are they doing Ephesians 4, right? How well are they equipping the saints for the work of ministry? And that speaks to what you just said, building leaders, making disciples, and then honestly like passing on the actual work of ministry to the people, rather than just, because honestly, if all you want to do is build a crowd, do it all yourself. Like it's actually easier. But so Ephesians 4, another thing we've done here is part of our review process is looking at the ideal team player by, is that Lencioni, I think, where like people like the ideal team player is humble, hungry, and smart. And we actually will grade people on humble, hungry, and smart as we're thinking through things like compensation and positions and stuff like that, because somebody who is exhibiting those humble, hungry, and smart is going to be most likely doing the work of Ephesians 4 in a church context. And so it takes a little more work than bottom line or sales numbers or whatever, or maybe not more work, different work. But like you said, there are trackable things in ministry that, and if you focus on the trackables too much, like it can ruin you. But they're a barometer for how well you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It makes me think of, I've never thought about this before, so this could be nonsense, but it makes me think of it's like a farmer. What makes a good farmer? I think it's if the farmer does all that's within his control to create good crops, but then there's so much that's outside of his control, like the weather and different things, where he might not have a lot of fruit in a season, but he still did a really good job at his job.
Yeah.
And so it's like we can measure in ministry, are we being faithful to do the things that we're called to do? Realizing it takes God to, give life and power to that according to his sovereign will to create the fruit. And so someone could be doing a good job and there's not as much noticeable fruit, but that's because salvation, sanctification, all those things, discipleship ultimately are up to the Lord. So we can measure like, that pastor, he's preaching faithfully, he's making disciples, he's training leaders. And maybe they didn't see as many conversions that year, but like at the end of the day, like that's up to the Lord. They were being faithful in what they're called to do. And you can measure that. And then I think another thing about our culture here is every year we have leadership vision that includes objectives and goals that are measurable. And then we can look back and say, did we accomplish those goals or not? And then I think those who are deciding on compensation can look at that and say, they set goals and then they accomplish them, and that's good work.
Yeah.
And that should be rewarded.
And as the question asker said, in sort of the softer, how did he say that?
Yeah, how do you boil down something with more of a soft skill set, like a children's minister, into a salary number, like soft rather than like hard skills, like being an engineer or whatever?
Yeah, and I think the objectives harden things a little bit, right? The objectives that once a person comes, there's a difference between when you're hiring somebody that's not on the staff and you're bringing them on the staff, what do you set their compensation at? And that actually is a really difficult thing, because when you look at it, you're interviewing somebody and you're hoping that they're going to be the right fit, particularly if it's an external hire. You're hoping that they're going to do the right fit and do those things, but setting their initial salary is the most difficult metric as it relates to these salary things. And so I'll talk about how we do that in just a minute. But once they get into that role, assessing that compensation on an annual basis becomes a lot easier because those defining objectives within their ministry, those goals that they're setting, what do you call them? The OKRs, the objectives and key results.
Yeah.
And there's a few other metrics that we use right now. What are the things like within the whole kind of, I'm thinking of those. Is it OKRs or what's the thing you and Nathan use on like the goals that they're setting and kind of what they're...
OKRs are one of the ways to frame it. I mean, really, it's just like, it is just the explanation of a goal and then like the different like milestones.
Yeah. So we have that all set up within our structures, but I talked to a guy that like was a network leader in the Northwest years ago on this because I was like super curious my first few years because once I became a lead pastor, I knew that I had to start setting policy and those kind of things in an organization. And then once we became a multi-church, that was scaling. And so I sat down with this guy for, I don't know, like an hour at Red Robin in the Portland airport area, his choice. And so I think I got a Whiskey River barbecue chicken wrap if you were keeping track at home. So
and 6 baskets of fries.
so I was like, dude, what? Tell me about the compensation. I just walked me through the compensation. This dude like that was in his 80s at the time, and walked me through the compensation thing. Like, how do you do this well at a church? And he said 3 things: cost of living, equitability, and merit. Like those are the 3. And I wrote a doc years ago on this. It was like one of our early policy docs on compensation structures. And so cost of living, like you have to assess the cost of living in your area versus the national average. So that gives you a benchmark. Vancouver's 9% above the national average in cost of living. So if you're comparing this salary to a salary in Oklahoma, or you hire like we did a music guy out of Wisconsin, like you got to look at where they're coming from, what the cost of living is there versus what it is in Vancouver, Washington, or Camas, Washington, or whatever else. So cost of living. And then equitability is a big one. And that's a huge metric where what does that role at similar size organizations make? And we have, and this is one thing that we've gotten in recent years. There's all sorts of national surveys out there that you can find. As I said, the free ones that are available online are usually very inaccurate. They'll give you a band that's like, from 50,000 to 100,000, that's typically what this, and you're like, what, how does that help me, right? This $50,000 thing. And are you talking about base salary? You're talking about total package. And so when you look at that stuff online, the free stuff is not typically super helpful because it's just too random of a set. But there are surveys, there are consulting agencies out there, and they're not expensive. There's surveys that we pay to get on an annual basis to keep ourselves in clarity in the market. They do specific analysis of your cost of living analysis of your area, where it's at compared to the national average. And then they talk about your specific church, the size of that church, and sort of the salary band that person should be in, right?
It's going to factor in like their experience too, right?
Yes, experience. So, and that's where you get to equitability. So is that person, what's their education level? What's their experience level? What's the size of the church or ministry or whatever that they're leading? What's the budget of that ministry? So you look at the profile of the person and you say, what is that position with that? And you can put all these metrics in. So on a pastoral, when you look at a resume, you can tell what's the education level, what are those types of things, and what's this person going to make at a similar sized church in a similar role. And all that data is available. And so we get that data. We have salary bands that are really clear for all of our roles. I mean, I'm talking from part-time administrative assistants to lead pastors and everything in between. And so we have literally bands where we say, okay, this person's in band 3 or band 4 or whatever, because that's what that position is. And then based upon the person, and that comes to the final one, the merit, right? The role, like the merit in the role. How are they doing? Like, are they accomplishing goals? Is there fruitfulness in ministry? Like you talked about, Ben, that can be season to season, but some of the other things Tyler talked about, hungry, humble, smart, the DNA of NGC, we understand that everything is not equal. Like bringing in a local lead pastor who's going to be in a revitalization for 2-3 years, that church might not numerically grow on paper, but if they're losing people because there's revitalization and changes going on and they're replacing those people and so they're plateaued, like the number by itself doesn't always tell the story. So you have to assess those things on a deeper level and have goals and metrics that are there. So when you look at all that, that's how you set those salaries and how you review them and how you continue to stay in the loop on it. But at NGC, this is a vital thing. This is the policies on this are continually being edited and developed and I think strengthened. And since we came together as the multi-church, we've done a ton of work on this the last few years because you were melding 2 multi-churches together, right? With 2 at NGC and 3 at SVC. And so they've now come together as Northwest Gospel Church with these 5 churches. And so that's created a context where we can, walk through it all and make sure that salaries are where they need to be and be a super generous church. And NGC is, and our elders are, on our leadership council specifically, and our finance team. These dudes are solid, generous, know what they're doing, and so it's a great church to be at, for sure.
Yeah. Well, if you want to work with us, nwgospel.com/jobs. I thought about that. Like, it's like 25 minutes in the episode and just said that. I'm going to say that in the intro too.
There you go.
There we go. But yeah, maybe this brought up questions for you. Hit us up, podcast@toBeTheChurch.com, in the comments on YouTube. Have a great week.